What a run. I've been thrilled at the sessions I've attended and at the possibilities and at the good work, not just the good work of our FREOPP scholars, but of the extraordinary people that they have attracted to join us in this. Our last session is a banger. Avik, our creator, co-founder of FREOPP, Lanhee Chen, who is at the Hoover Institution and is also in an Uber. Nope. There, he's here. Never mind. And then Ramesh, Ponnuru, and Kent Lassman. So please welcome our crew to the stage for the final session.
We got our last session here. Really thrilled to have some very busy people who are taking time out of their calendar to be with us today to talk about the future, the politics of freedom and progress in 2028. And I thought, you know, there's two elements to this from my standpoint, but if you guys have different thoughts, I welcome them. One is, you know, it might seem too early to talk about, okay, what are the two parties going to look like in 2020 when we next have a presidential election? Because I assume that Trump isn't going to run for a third term. I think two is probably enough for him. But then there's also what are some things about the political landscape that may be different, and the policy landscape that may be different in 28 than they are today. And I'll throw out a couple of things as just examples of what I'm talking about. I am really interested in your thoughts on who you know might be the players in the 2028 nomination contest, particularly on the R side, but also on the D side. And then, you know, one thing I was thinking of as an example of the policy landscape and how it may change is, you think about abortion, which has been a dominant force in our politics, particularly on the Republican side, for a very long time. And that has meant, among other things, that blue state governors had a tough time running for higher office who were Republicans because they were typically pro-choice, and that was difficult in the politics of Roe v. Wade. Maybe in a world in which state legislatures have decided, and states have decided what their abortion policies are, and governors aren't being judged on their stances on this stuff as much, maybe that becomes a less salient issue. Maybe other issues become more salient. I don't know, but I think some of these things may be interesting over the future. But I throw it to you, Ramesh. You know, you spent a lot of time on TV talking about this stuff, but also as editor of National Review, you are, in many ways, you know, you are a flagship institution in the conservative movement. You're talking to all the most famous, established people, but also up-and-comers. What are you seeing out there?
Well, the first thing is I'm going to do something that I learned from all these TV shows, which is not to answer your question, particularly on the question of who might be figuring in the 2028 campaign. I just remember after the 2004 election, there was a lot of discussion in this city about the titanic struggle that was going to take place in 2008 between the front runners for the Republican nomination, Bill Frist and George Allen, neither of whom was even in public life by the time that 2008 came around. Instead, I'll just talk a little bit about the general evolution of the Republican coalition, which has obviously become a more working class coalition, particularly if you define working class the way we've all decided to over the last decade in terms of not having a college degree. And that obviously changes the priorities of the coalition. I think it's clearly had a huge effect on where Republicans come down on issues of immigration and trade. And along with that transformation, there's been a lot of discussion about the eclipse of free market economics and free market fundamentalism, so-called. But the thing that I think is very interesting is how you're not really seeing that on the ground. These have been, the last 3 years have been the best years for school choice in the history of that movement. Freedom to innovate in the energy sector has been a really strong political issue where even Democrats who are at best ambivalent about it have been forced to give up ground. I imagine, although there are some knotty personnel issues to work through, that things like short-term limited duration health insurance are going to be re-liberalized as they were in the first Trump administration. The vice president-elect is often thought of as somebody who is hostile to free markets, and yet on what I think is actually one of the more pressing issues before our country, housing, he has been quite forthright and I think sound and correct in saying that what we need is to free people up to build more housing, which I think at the root of a lot of problems. So I think that in some ways what has happened is some of the kind of themes of our politics have changed. I think the theme of freedom, or particularly individual freedom understood as autonomy, is maybe less compelling in American life now than it's ever been in my lifetime, possibly because our population's older and so you don't have that kind of restless yearning for freedom. But also free markets in practice and freedom as a practical aspiration is still alive and kicking, and in some ways thriving better than ever.
You think about freedom of speech and freedom of thought and the concerns about censorship. I mean, that seems an area where people are very exercised about what they see as restrictions on their ability to say what they think.
Yes, unfortunately, neither of our parties is led at the moment by people who are committed to free speech.
Lanhee, you're a guy who, we've obviously known each other a very long time now. One thing I know about you that maybe not everybody knows about you is that people who are thinking about running for president often call you and look you up and say, okay, what should I be thinking about? The hypothetical universe of people who are going to be making those calls to you over the next 12 months, what kind of advice would you give them?
Well, it's never too early. I think the funny thing about politics is we did just get through an election, but I think already some of the basic moves around what kind of infrastructure you want to set up. I think about a guy like the current governor of Virginia who may be leaving office soon because he's term limited, and how he might think about an organization and approach thinking about a set of issues. And, for me at least, I've always felt it works best when somebody has an issue or a single set of issues they're really devoted to thinking about and talking about. And, it can be a theme, right? It can be a theme around individual opportunity or enhancing opportunities for the working class. I mean, whatever the theme is, I think having a singular focus is probably a good idea if you're developing a brand. And a number of people, I think, will have the opportunity to do that over the next couple of years. And obviously, the vice president-elect is in a unique position because he will have the benefits of being, in many ways, the heir apparent. I think his own philosophy is probably a lot more completely thought through in a lot of ways. And so I think he's going to have a natural platform from which to run. But there'll be a lot of others too, right? And I think that it's going to be important for all these folks to be thoughtful in their approach and to recognize that it is an open field. Even though there'll be an incumbent vice president, it's an open field. Not as open as the Democrats. I mean, I think the Democrats have a fundamental identity crisis that they've got to navigate through, amongst other crises in their party. But I definitely see this as, this can be a very exciting time for people who like politics, because these next 2 years are all about the shadow boxing. And all of that sort of breaks out into the open after we get to the midterms in 26. And it'll be here before you know it. And 26 will be a really important year. Traditionally, that first midterm for an incumbent president, or it's not his first midterm, but the midterm for an incumbent president isn't great. And so, there'll be opportunities for both parties and a lot of candidates to remake themselves between now and then.
One thing we talked about in the opening session with Patrick Ruffini is that one of the inversions that's going on is low propensity voters are now more Republican, high propensity, high education voters are more Democrat, which means that in theory, if existing patterns are true to form, the midterms will be more heavily Democratic overall because the high propensity voters turn out, the low propensity voters only turn out for the presidential years.
And special elections even more so, and we'll have a bunch of them if House members keep going into the cabinet.
Right. Yeah. Kent, you run one of the most important think tanks in town, the Competitive Enterprise Institute. What's your vantage point on what we might be caring about and talking about in 2028?
Well, I think we're going to, I want to pick up on where Ramesh started. We're going to continue to see fissures that people either try to push apart or bring back together, particularly right of center. It is not the case, I don't quite agree with Ramesh that the last several years have been great for innovation in energy or innovation in these other aspects of life, because I think a lot of that has been driven by $6-7 trillion worth of subsidy spending, right? It's not genuine market risk and reward investment decisions. But the nature of what are we for, as opposed to not liking the other guy, not being happy with joy and someone's laugh. The nature of what we're for, I think, is going to boil down to the age-old question in politics, which is who gets to decide, right? And ultimately, that question, particularly on the right of center, it will pivot, and it will pivot in the coming years as people come forward to carry new messages from new places, also from the administration. It's going to pivot around the question of, are we going to be leaning toward political decision, politicized decisions, regulatory decisions, or are we going to be leaning toward personal decisions in the private sphere of life and markets? And that pivot will matter. So the vice president-elect has been pretty sound on housing, like Ramesh said. He's also been pretty unsound on much of our labor policy. And a key to mobility is understanding where I might go and where my children might go with their place in the workforce. And those fissures exist within individual politicians, they exist within political coalitions, and it will be really important for us to work hard to find that common ground where we can and to win that fight, because it is not out of reach for a major political party in this country to turn away from things like individual liberty and to turn away from market decisions in favor of planning. We've had a lot of discussion from very prominent leaders, political leaders in the last 6 years, suggesting that the way to make things happen is to take control of these agencies and supercharge them. And I see that's a big problem.
We're going to open up to questions from the audience soon, but wanted to throw out this. I assume, and tell me if you feel differently, that Trump's endorsement in 2028 could be a factor in who the Republican nominees. Maybe not. Maybe if he's a lame duck, people don't care. But I would think just his hold on the party has been pretty strong. Presumably, J.D. Vance would get his endorsement as a loyal trooper. But what's your take on that? Would Trump's endorsement matter in 2028? I mean, obviously, some of it depends on how the performance of the administration is and how popular it is in 28. But is that going to be a defining factor?
I mean, I think one of the most striking things about this cycle was the degree to which people talk about the red shift. And so I've looked at this a little bit in my home state of California. And it's not so much a red shift as a Trump shift, right? So a lot of down-ticket candidates didn't necessarily, I mean, they may have benefited a little bit, but it wasn't enough to get them across the finish line.
We saw that in the swing states, too. We were talking about that yesterday.
This gap, a lot of these Senate races in places like Nevada and Wisconsin are illustrative of that. So I do think some of it, to your point, Avik, is going to depend on the performance of the administration. I think some of it's going to depend on where Trump's numbers are as we get closer to 28. But I also think it's the case that I would not automatically be so sure that Trump's magic, as it were, from an electoral standpoint, translates to other people. And we have seen this repeatedly happen where candidates wrap themselves in the mantle of Donald Trump, and it doesn't work for them because they're not Donald Trump, right? He's a uniquely gifted figure in the politics of our time. And so I just think it's going to be hard for that. I mean, the endorsement is going to matter, but I don't see it being dispositive necessarily, precisely for this reason that I think Trump is a uniquely singular figure, and I'm not sure there's been as much translation effect as people would like.
Ramesh, you got thoughts on that? Kent, go ahead.
I would just add, not only might it not be dispositive, it's very difficult to predict from where we sit which direction it will go, right? It might be a big negative. And to presume, we can guess a lot of things about the next administration, but to presume that it will be a linear path is probably a stretch. It goes too far, right? That's not our experience with the first time he was president. It's a bumpy road when he's president. And so it might be that by the time people are launching exploratory committees and things like that, the dance with him actually points against, it works against someone like the vice president.
When you were saying that Trump would probably or might well endorse Vance in 2028 because he'd have been a loyal soldier, I think it's a very shrewd bet on Trump's loyalty to the people who work under him and his steadfastness and constancy. These are, of course, famous traits of our president-elect, and we'll see how that plays out. The other thing that strikes me about the singularity of Trump as a political talent is he also had 3 decades as a non-political celebrity.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, he was in Home Alone, right? I mean, he was in an REM song in the 1980s, and so
WrestleMania.
It's very hard to replicate.
Yeah.
Among other films.
Yes. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Somebody's got to be the libertarian on stage.
Lanhee, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, you recently ran for statewide office in California for the incredibly glamorous position of comptroller. And it took up a lot of your time. You know, it was an incredible challenge. I mean, I think anyone has got to say respect for taking that on as a Republican candidate running in California. But tell us about it. What was that like? What did you learn from it? You know, if a Republican wants to run in a blue state like California, what's the route to competitiveness?
Yeah,
what's the route to persuading people?
My advice would be don't. But look, I think the more distance I've gotten from it, the more I feel like I'm able to kind of be objective about the opportunities and challenges. And I think that when you're looking, I mean, California is a very extreme example for all sorts of different reasons, but it's also kind of uniquely broken. And that's really the question in my mind is what happens over the next couple of years to either create a better opportunity structure for there to be a more competitive set of candidate-based campaigns. Because if you look at the issues, if you look at how voters feel about key issues, they actually want change. They want reform, right? They vote, for example, we voted overwhelmingly for a ballot proposition this year that would make crime criminal again in many cases. We elected a district attorney in the county of Los Angeles, which is the biggest county in my state, that will be a reform-minded person who's actually gonna, I don't know, put criminals in jail. And there were recalls of corrupt progressive mayors in places like Oakland, and the change in the city of San Francisco to a mayor that is allegedly going to be more moderate. So, I mean, there are, on like specific issue dimensions, you can see some of that change happening. But to put it all together is still an incredibly difficult exercise. And the reason why is because of the way that there are institutional factors that work against you in big places like LA and the Bay Area. The public employee unions are extremely powerful still and control a lot of political assets. And then, you know, the Republican Party, just from an image perspective, is still seen relatively negatively by a lot of Californians. Now, that may change as time goes on, but I don't think it's a 4-year endeavor. I think it's got to be an 8, 10, 12-year endeavor. And that's really the long haul in politics. So, I mean, I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot. It's a great, I love my state. It's a great place to be, but it's pretty screwed up still.
All right, questions from the audience. We got some mics circulating around. I can't see anything, so just start talking if you got a mic.
Hello. Appreciate the discussion. I was wondering what you guys thought, especially Kent, about kind of like the trends of the breakdowns of fusionism, you know, the kind of marriage between, you know, the religious folks in the country and free market policies. And, you pointed out J.D. Vance's policies are kind of leaning away from that old alliance. So I was wondering what you guys thought about that.
I think there's two really important things baked into that question. The first is the nature of politics in our system, in our constitutional system, is necessarily, and I know you've all heard this before, but it's necessarily additive, right? It's a coalition exercise. And it is not likely that in the near term, we're going to see any major party command majorities, right? We don't even have close to pluralities of registered voters in these different parties. The rise of independence really matters. And reaching out to people in a coalition style, a fusion style, is essential if you want to affect change, if you want something other than just attaining office. And that struggle that I alluded to early in this discussion, it's ongoing, and there will be people engaged in that who reach across and say, we can work on this thing together. And there will be people who draw up the walls and say, no, absolutely not. We're in charge, we're gonna do it my way, or my faction is leading in this state, therefore that's how this whole state's gonna go. The successful path, whether we call it fusionism or something else, I have no problems with Frank Meyer's terminology. I don't know that it's exactly the same set of issues that we need to worry about in the 2020s and 2030s.
Fluoride's come back.
Fluoride has come back. The Cold War looks different today, right? We have a new Cold War. But those issues are available to us if we speak to the values that people care about, right? The one thing that is true through the history of the concept, the history of an idea of progress, which is not just in the name of FREOPP, it's not just in the name of this panel, is that progress always has a moral dimension. And I think the central moral question that we have a chance to build of a market-driven, the things that I care about, but a coalition that works and is durable, is around that question of who decides, right? Are we gonna make more decisions in government, or are we gonna make more decisions in the private sphere? And that fusionist path is available for those who are willing to take it.
You know, you're reminding me, you're reminding me of, oh, go ahead, Ramesh, I'll pipe in.
I'll just say, I think reports of the death of fusionism are greatly exaggerated. What are the great accomplishments of the last Trump administration? Tax cuts and the appointment of conservative judges, including judges who overturned Roe v. Wade after the Trump administration was over. I mean, if that's not fusionism in practice, I don't know what is. And this is an administration that's going to take office that is talking about deregulation and conscience protections. So it doesn't, I agree, the particular formulations that Frank Meyer used, in specific arguments, specific issues, those come and go. But Meyer didn't think that, one of the reasons he didn't like the term fusionism was he didn't think it was putting together anything. He thought he was articulating something that was already present in American experience and American tradition. You can find it in Calvin Coolidge's remarks on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration, when he says about the Declaration, there is a finality that is exceedingly restful, where he's making an argument for limited government on the basis of essentially natural law. And you can see the same thing going all the way back to the founders, which, there's never been a group of people more concerned about freedom and virtue than the American founding generation. And I think it's going to take a lot more than fads in intellectual life or even particular election returns to spell the end of that great American tradition.
I related observation / question, which is, one of the things that some people in the self-styled new right, which is really the new old right, argue is that the old three-legged stool of libertarian economics, social conservatism, and a hawkish foreign policy, that's obsolete and out the window and kind of should be in a wax museum. But maybe we just have a new three-legged stool. Maybe the new three-legged stool is deregulation and tax cuts under Trump. The social conservatives may be like, let's say, not just immigrate, the anti-woke stuff, immigration and trade, which is economic policy, overlaps with economic policy, but has a social component to it as well. And then foreign policy that's maybe more restrained than in the Bush years, but Reagan wasn't running around trying to nation build, right? He was a fairly cautious guy about the use of American power. So maybe it's just that the three-legged stool is there, the coalition is still there, to Kent's point, but it's just changed a little bit.
My question?
Okay,
so
sorry.
that it is not just a red swell, which is a wave that never breaks. Speaking to your point about the new priorities, what would the panelists consider as the new priorities that can be achievable so that the midterm elections can actually cement some of this progress and have something achievable to show by the time the next election comes around?
Governance. This is not an administration where people are going long to bet that they are going to be competent at governance. And I think the American people, we see this in the exit polling just in the last month, they want to see things work. They're tired of all the other stuff, all the shouting, all the crazy. And if they can get their head around, our job is to make things work, that's a theme that'll resonate for a long time.
One area where I think that there does need to be some serious action that follows up on campaign promises is immigration. That is certainly a priority of the new right, but it's also been a priority of elements of an older conservative movement as well. This is also something that's split a lot of conservatives and libertarians over the years. Interestingly, though, Trump has been on various sides of this issue in his political career. He, at one point, wanted a radical reduction in legal immigration levels. For the last 5 years or so, he's been talking about wanting record levels of legal immigration. I think that the level is actually maybe less interesting and important than the question of the basis of that legal immigration flow. Should it be as oriented as it has been toward the reunification of extended families, or should it be more oriented toward the recruitment of highly skilled individuals? But maybe even before that, to have an immigration policy, you do have to be willing to enforce the immigration policy that you have and want to have. There's been a lot of discussion of mass deportation of illegal immigrants. The actual shape, I don't think deportation can be a dirty word, because any immigration policy that's serious has to involve some deportation. But the exact shape of what this policy is going to look like, I think that's very much up for grabs. I think that it is something, though, that needs to be delivered on. There needs to be some tangible progress at getting control of the border. I personally think that one aspect of this that has not gotten enough attention from Republicans, including from Trump himself, is the idea of sanctions on employers if they do not take steps to verify the legal status of people that they hire. That's something that historically has split the right. But I do think that is something where repeated elections do suggest there is one side of this debate that we ought to come down on.
I think there's consensus at least among Republicans about this. I mean, maybe there wasn't in the past, but I think Trump has won the debate. But I think what's interesting is, as you were alluding to, he actually has, his views on immigration are not that different from Jeb Bush's. Jeb Bush and Clint Bullock wrote a book 10 years ago called Immigration Wars. And if you look at what they were proposing, it's border security plus let's reform legal immigration so it's more skills-based rather than family reunification. A few years back, Rahan Salam, who we were talking about off stage, president of the Manhattan Institute, old friend, he wrote a book called, I can't remember what it's called, Native Son or something like that, or Civil War, or
New Melting Pot? I forget what it was.
Can't remember the name of it. Anyway,
Melting Pot or Civil War. That's
Melting Pot or Civil War. And he made the same argument, basically. We need to have border security, and we need to reform legal immigration so that it's not family reunification. We're bringing in the PhDs and the engineers and the people who can actually contribute to the economy. And then when Trump was president in 2019, he proposed exactly the same thing. He proposed, let's crack down on and build a wall and secure the border. But he has said, and he's had arguments and disagreements with Steve Bannon about this, where he's like, it's really stupid. We bring all these smart people from India and China to study at our best universities, and then instead of keeping them here, we send them back. Like, how stupid is that? And Steve Bannon's like, well, we should send them back because we should want fewer brown people to run companies in Silicon Valley. And Trump's like, no, this is stupid. Let's keep them here. And so I think one thing that's kind of ironic is for all the noise around how Republicans are betraying each other on immigration policy, there's kind of a through line and consensus as to what that policy should look like if Republicans can actually get their act together and pass it.
I want to say thank you, though, for also mentioning Reihan, because it's very important that you, Reihan, and I, that we establish that we are three separate people, just for the record.
All right, further questions?
I have a question about foreign policy. One of the ways that the Republican Party has changed in my lifetime is foreign policy, and it seems now the trend is more America first and isolationist. Would y'all comment on that, please?
Yeah, well, Ukraine is another issue where I think that there are people read into Trump views that he may not hold, or at least may not hold durably. And he was, in fact, instrumental to unlocking the bipartisan deal that got aid flowing a few months ago to Ukraine again. I wonder whether Trump really wants to be in a position where he can be said to have been the president on whose watch Ukraine was lost, whether he will like the idea of that perception of American and Trumpian weakness. It's not clear to me that is what he wants. Now, I would notice that the vice president-elect, although he has very strong views about this conflict and about the prudence of U.S. policy there, has not been saying a whole lot about it over the last several weeks.
I think the great national security challenge of the next decade is going to be China, right? And how we as a nation approach that competition, the adversarial nature of the relationship. I think that there are a lot of ways in which you can make an argument that Trump might be one of the few people who could broker a longer-term détente with China, particularly if he's willing to compromise on issues that past U.S. presidents have not. Now, I think those issues are important, but they do signal, in my mind, to your question about the shift in foreign policy. They form the basis of this shift away from a traditional worldview premised on a shared set of important values that the U.S. and our allies would advocate for around the world, an emphasis on human rights, an emphasis on democracy and the preservation of democracy and the sovereignty of free people in places like Taiwan, I'm thinking of, for example. I mean, those are long-held values and elements of American national security policy that have transcended, I think, party and leader. But I think that to break the log jam on China, as it were, it may take a paradigm shift. Now, we can argue whether that normatively is a good thing or a bad thing, but I do think this is one area where we might see some change over the next couple of years, which is a change on the conventional wisdom around how one deals with China, how one wins that competition, or at least comes to a point where you reach a reasonable accommodation. Because the current path is unsustainable for neither China nor the United States, in my view. And so there's going to have to be a path-breaking move at one point or another. We hope and pray that path-breaking move is not toward kinetic conflict, but that possibility exists.
If I could just jump back one on the China question, and it's an exception to the optimism that I've been trying to convey on many issues. I don't know that there is an economic strategy that makes sense vis-a-vis China that does not involve improved ties to other countries, whether it's Vietnam, India, the Philippines, Japan, the Koreas. And I don't know that that is going to be the instinct of the incoming administration.
They did do a great job on the Abraham Accords last time they were in power.
Right, but I'm particularly thinking about trade
Yeah.
Right.
and trade with Pacific Rim countries.
No, I think it's a good point, Ramesh, because I think that relies on a certain multilateralism that this administration will not be keen to engage in.
But even bilateral deals, you know, if you are really committed to high tariff walls to protect your domestic market, to you know, insourcing instead of like friendshoring, for example,
Right.
then you're not going to want to do that kind of thing.
But is that where the Trump administration is going to end up? Because my sense is they're really targeting China with a lot of the tariffs. It's not going to be the across-the-board 10% thing that Lighthizer has proposed in the past. But
I love your confidence.
okay.
One of the things, I don't want to speak for Ramesh. He's right here. He's very good at these things. He's a very clear thinker. But one of the things I heard from him, which is absolutely true, is that you cannot have a sound long-term place in the world, a foreign policy, which includes different things, right? It's domestic security policy, it's foreign policy, it's soft power, the diplomatic relations. You can't have sound foreign policy if your own economy cannot finance it, right? If you can't generate the wealth necessary to engage in the trading relationships, to build a Pacific Navy, to do all of the things, including investment through innovation that leads to the sorts of things that allow for dominance, whether that was the space race or the AI race today. Healthy economies matter for foreign policy. An across-the-board 10% tariff, that's the getting in the gate sort of proposition from the president-elect, likely to shave 1 percentage point off of economic growth. That is not a way to develop a foreign policy that works. The American economy does not, it's not just a trade-off between guns and butter, right? We can buy tanks or we can have domestic goods. It's also, as we're hearing, are you investing in ways that makes the rest of the world, your partners in those places, better off? The Vietnam, the Singapore, all around the Pacific Rim. And that's something that we need to think more holistically about, how the economics of policy and the security of policy interact with each other.
Hi.
Jonathan, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi. Oh,
Yep. Jonathan, go ahead.
Slight pivot. The Freedom and Progress 2028 is arrived at via 2026. And the midterm Trump experience last time was really interesting. The candidate selection, the journeys to ring kissing that exploded. You know, how would you advise the burgeoning kind of class of statewide candidates in the Republican-ish universe on including using, soliciting the administration for their 2026 ambitions?
So I think that the benefit to our politics having gotten more, I think our politics, let's see, the politics of our policymaking have become a little more flexible over time. And the benefit to that, I mean, I think there's a lot of downside. There's a lot of downside because it lacks a level of coherence. But I would say that the benefit to that is that you can pick and choose a little bit, right? You can go in and see what elements of the, let's say, the administration's agenda, for example, might have more salience in where you're at versus other elements of the agenda. And you can pick and choose, right? Because we don't place a huge value anymore on a completely coherent policy agenda. I mean, there was a place in time where that was very important. And I think there were candidates who thought a lot more about that. My sense in the politics of now is that you find that less and less. And it's a little saddening to me personally, but it's also the political reality of where we're at, that you can find, to my point earlier, you can find a single issue on which there's great salience and great interest and take a position on that issue that may have some inconsistency with another, and people can hold that intention okay now in a way that they didn't before. And I think voters are much more forgiving of that now than they were before. So I guess my view on this is that we have a little bit of wait and see in this. We have to see how the first 2 years unfold, and then we have to see, maybe not the first 2 years, but we have to let a year unfold at least. And then when we get to 2025, to the tail end of 25 and early 26, we'll have a better sense of what's worked and what hasn't. And then what has, more importantly, what has political salience and what doesn't, because we'll have been through enough of maybe a set of political battles where we can see how real people feel about certain decisions versus others.
I guess.
Hi. So, one of the great things about this conference has been FREOPP's willingness to address emerging issues in a very proactive way, emerging issues that really have pulled people away from left-wing thoughts to come to a more free market and freedom-oriented point of view. They've done this on immigration, on healthcare, on all kinds of different issues, and we've seen it at the panels here. We had a panel on free market climate policy, arguing about how free markets are essentially decarbonizing and clean. These kinds of messages that are being put forward have done a great job of peeling people away from the left and pulling voters over to the anti-democratic side, at least, of the fence.
Just to be clear, we are a 501c3, not a partisan organization.
Well, yes, but what I want to ask is, in terms of what think tanks and free market-oriented journalists, et cetera, the issues that they should be thinking about and working on and financing, what are those issues that we can continue to work on that will help to peel away people and bring them into the free market camp? Where is the high value to focus on?
I think after the last episode of American history vis-a-vis inflation, economic security, and economic security is not just savings rates. It includes other things that are, I know, have been themes for FREOPP in the past and some of the studies, but mobility, the ability, as Ramesh was talking about, home security, right? Being able to invest in property or a home. Economic security will drive a lot of, I think, the attention on what Lanhee was telling us about that map that we all looked at that first couple days after the election, where there was the lifting of all the red, right? There was no blue on the map. And that was, people were looking for something where they thought it's going to be better vis-a-vis the core things that I need to worry about around my kitchen table. The rent, the groceries, the insurance, can I pay for my the tires on the truck, that sort of thing. And to the extent that I know you work on energy policy, right? To the extent that you can make that viable for a candidate as they talk about security in that community, right? The lights stay on, unlike, unfortunately, sometimes in California. That's what's going to resonate.
Yeah.
Let me make a pitch also for higher education reform. I think that sort of the higher education cartel is something that needs to be attacked on multiple fronts, and that in some ways we've got propitious political circumstances for that, for the idea that we should expand pathways to opportunity for people who don't want to go to the traditional four-year college institution. And I think that our message should be that we want more options, more certification options, more financing options, that there are just a lot of different paths to success. We have had a generation and a half, 2 generations maybe, of bipartisan insistence that basically everybody, you graduate high school, you go to college, you get your degree, you then get a job that requires that degree. This is something that we have devoted a lot of government resources to, and it's working for about 1 out of 6 young people. And it's working for the 1 out of 6 young people who are most likely to already be successful without those sorts of government policies. So I think that there's just an enormous amount of work to be done there, whether it is having different kinds of licensing authorities, whether it is coming up with new private sector certifications so that people don't always have to get that degree. reformulating federal aid programs so that we are not just funneling money to the same institutions that we've been funneling them to for the last 2 generations that are also, by the way, and I think some people have noticed this, hostile to us and our values. I think that's something that the new conservative coalition may be better equipped to do than the old conservative coalition was.
This, just very quickly, it not only does not do well by those 1 in 6, or only for 1 in 6 young people who, as Ramesh points out, likely would do okay anyway. It does absolutely no good and is a drag. It's a negative. It's on the wrong side of the midpoint for adults changing careers, or adults that we read about in a memoir with a word elegy in it, right? So these programs and this approach to human capital is a ripe area, as Ramesh is saying.
I want to take one last question if we've got one.
Yeah, I got a bit of a different question. So with the sort of identity crisis the Democrats are having and the Trump effect kind of historically changing the demographic vote we've had and the rise of independent media becoming more popular and young people being a little bit more moderate, do you think in 2028 there's more room and opportunity for a third party candidate to have success, or is the machine too strong still, or what's that trajectory look like in your opinion?
I mean, I think there are, I suppose there are pockets of support and individual offices and races where I could see an independent candidate doing well. But on a national level, or even if we're talking about congressional races or in many cases statewide races, I still think that the institutional push against third parties' independence is too strong. I think the two parties still have too much of a hold over the legal and institutional mechanisms that largely drive electoral outcomes in these cases. I think that the research is fairly clear on that question. And even in places where there's been efforts to create institutional reform, electoral reform, like in California, where we have a system that has nonpartisan primaries. We have our top 2 system in California. There are other systems elsewhere. The political science evidence, so far at least, has not suggested that it's produced more moderated candidates, actually. So that's the interesting element to all of this, is that even in situations where the electoral system has been reformed to produce the kind of outcomes that you might imagine, it hasn't exactly delivered. Now, maybe we've got to give it some more time, but myself am skeptical.
You know, we're coming to the end of our time together. Maybe I can ask each of you, if you think about the next 4 years, where is it, whether it's an issue or it's our politics, on what topic would you feel like you have the most optimism that 4 years from now we're going to look back and say we had a lot of success advancing freedom and progress? I've stumped the panel.
Well, at the risk of going first and being upstaged by my brighter panelists here, the one area that I think is most available, which is not to say most likely, I might be the only person that I'm spending time, the people I spend time with in the last month are all enamored with electoral results of November 2024 and these red maps. And I am scarred by the chaotic nature of the last 8 years, right? The legal chaos of the last 8 years. But the one place where the trend lines all look good, the political rhetoric looks good, there are people with concrete ideas about how to govern better, is on regulatory reform, right? Significant changes in federal law through the Supreme Court in the last 3.5 years. Significant effort to change the nature of major regulatory agencies. Politicians talking about it. Those are all great things. Those are great signals, and I can't wait to see more actual reform.
I guess the reason I paused after you asked the question is my own thinking. I tend to emphasize not all of the great gains that we're going to make here, there, somewhere else, but all of the harms that we can avoid. And we are not going to have a government that is bent on, destroying the Supreme Court. We are not going to see, with the exception of international trade, gigantic tax increases. We are not going to see efforts to change the legal playing field even more in favor of unions. And in fact, we're going to continue to see decline in union density in our country. And I think sometimes we take some of these things for granted, and we ought to stop and savor some of these victories that we have achieved just by stopping action.
I guess this is a great point that Kent makes about regulatory reform, and I think that one area where we're going to see a lot of application is in the energy space. And I think I feel more hopeful about the next several years that we are going to see efforts to really expand the aperture of how we think about energy, the applications of energy around machine learning, and how that will affect our economy. So I have some optimism in that space, I would say.
I would throw in, there's a potential, of course, a lot of people focus on how, the Skynet will destroy the world, but the ability of artificial intelligence to attack some of these complexities in our regulatory environment, trim regulations, and maybe help private businesses navigate regulation without having to hire dozens of lawyers to comply. That could be a source of incredible efficiencies as well. And as we all know, that space is moving so rapidly. It'll be really interesting to see 4 years from now what technological advancements are able to increase social mobility, increase prosperity in America as a result. Well, listen, it's been an amazing 2 days. I'm sure you all feel the same way. We've had record attendance at this conference. I want to thank our donors, our sponsors, all of you. Rebecca Atwood, our Vice President, and Tabitha Matthews on our team and Part 2 events for the incredibly hard work, and Bobby Sherwood for putting this conference together. We can't wait to see you next year, and we look forward to staying in touch about all the great things that you all are doing and that we're doing together. Thank you very much. Thanks to our panel.